Elderly black woman kicked out at car dealership. 5 hours later, she owns the company. Elizabeth Johnson walked into the sleek, glass panel dealership with a mixture of quiet excitement and nostalgia. This wasn't just another errand or an impulse visit. To Elizabeth, stepping into that high-end dealership was the culmination of decades of hard work, sacrifice, and perseverance. But just minutes later, humiliation washed over her as she was rudely kicked out by the staff. Before we start the story, tell us where you are watching from in the comments, and if you love these kinds of stories, click the subscribe button now. Like and share this video to others. At 68 years old, Elizabeth had spent most of her life climbing uphill battles, ones she conquered with determination and grace. Today was supposed to be the reward for it all. The moment she stepped inside, however, the weight of the dealership's atmosphere hit her like a cold wind. Bright fluorescent lights reflected off the glossy surfaces of luxury cars, their paint gleaming under meticulous care. The polished floors looked as though they had never known a speck of dust. It was a showroom designed to intimidate, a temple of wealth where only the elite were deemed worthy to worship. The air was crisp and still as the morning sunlight glinted off the polished glass walls of Crown Motors, one of the most prestigious luxury car dealerships in the city. Inside, everything gleamed with a cold, corporate perfection. The faint hum of soft jazz played in the background, blending with the low murmurs of salesmen speaking in carefully measured tones. To the casual observer, it was a place of exclusivity and elegance, a playground for the wealthy and privileged. But beneath the surface, Crown Motors had its own unspoken rules. Here, first impressions mattered more than anything. If you didn't look the part, you were immediately categorized, dismissed, or ignored. Have you ever experienced a situation where you were wrongly judged because of your skin color or your appearance? Share your experience in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to enjoy this story more. Around Elizabeth, wealthy-looking customers floated effortlessly through the room. Men in tailored suits discussed custom leather interiors, and women draped in designer handbags and jewelry sipped champagne, while sales staff attended to them as though they were royalty. Each customer was treated with the utmost care. Chairs were brought out for them to rest, offers of imported coffee and premium wine flowed freely, and no request was deemed too outrageous. In stark contrast, Elizabeth received no such welcome. The staff at Crown Motors didn't truly look at her. As Elizabeth Johnson stepped through the sleek revolving doors, the faint chatter of the sales staff momentarily paused. Her presence didn't match what they were expecting. She wasn't what they were used to. Her simple yet elegant outfit, a beige blazer over a neatly pressed blouse and black trousers, didn't scream money. Her worn leather bag, which carried her important documents, had seen better days. And unlike the affluent customers being doted on, Elizabeth stood alone, clutching her bag, scanning the cars with a calm, discerning gaze. Her face held a subtle but hopeful smile, though none of the staff seemed to notice or care. She had stepped out of a modest car, parked at the far edge of the lot, carrying herself with a confidence that didn't require validation. Taking in the cars on display, her eyes landed on a sleek, silver luxury sedan, and for a moment, she imagined herself driving it. One person did notice her, though. Martha, a young and nervous junior employee standing near the reception desk, watched Elizabeth closely. Martha had only been working at the dealership for a few months and had already learned how things operated. Tom, the sales manager, ran the place like his personal kingdom. Customers who looked the part, wealthy, confident, and more often than not white, were treated like royalty. Anyone who didn't fit that mold, ignored. Martha hesitated, glancing at Elizabeth, who had begun admiring a sleek, silver luxury sedan near the center of the showroom. There was something warm and genuine about the older woman that immediately drew Martha in. But as much as she wanted to approach her, Martha knew better. She had seen what happened to employees who went against Tom's standards. And just as Martha feared, Tom was already heading toward Elizabeth, his sharp gaze locked on her like a predator sizing up its prey. Tom was young, arrogant, and dressed to impress. His navy blue suit was tailored to perfection, and his slicked-back hair gleamed under the showroom lights. He thrived on power, his inflated ego feeding off the approval of wealthy customers and the fear of his staff. Tom, the sales manager, was the kind of man who thrived on belittling others to feel powerful. He gave Elizabeth a once-over, his smile thin and condescending. He stood across the showroom, near the entrance. He leaned casually against a desk, scanning the room with a smug expression, as if he owned the place. At his side stood Rick, the general manager, a middle-aged man with graying temples and a perpetual frown. Rick rarely smiled, and when he did, it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Tom's gaze landed on Elizabeth as she entered. He nudged Rick with his elbow, muttering under his breath, loud enough for a few other staff members to hear. "Did someone lose their grandma? Looks like she's in the wrong place." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "What's she doing here? Doesn't look like she's here to buy anything. Probably looking for directions." The other sales staff nearby exchanged amused glances, their laughter quiet but unmistakable. It was the kind of laughter that carried disdain, the kind that made it clear they had already decided who Elizabeth was before she even had a chance to speak. Were they right to judge Elizabeth just by her appearance? If you believe they were wrong, subscribe to the channel now. Only those who believe it's right to judge people unfairly won't subscribe now. Elizabeth, oblivious to their whispers, or perhaps choosing to ignore them, walked slowly through the showroom. Her eyes lit up as she admired the cars on display. A sleek red sports car caught her attention first. She paused, taking in the way the light danced off its flawless paint. Her fingers lightly grazed the edge of a brochure stand nearby, but she didn't pick one up. She simply took her time, moving from car to car, studying each one with genuine appreciation. To Elizabeth, this wasn't just a visit to a dealership. It was a moment that carried decades of personal significance. From a young age, Elizabeth had loved cars. Growing up in a modest neighborhood with little to her name, her father had been a mechanic, and his tiny garage had been her playground. She could still remember the smell of motor oil and the sound of her father humming as he worked under the hood of a beat-up sedan. She had spent hours sitting on a wooden stool, watching her father's hands bring life back to engines others had long given up on. It was in that tiny garage that she first fell in love with the artistry of cars, the power they held, the freedom they symbolized. He would tell her stories about the sleek luxury cars he'd seen in magazines, always dreaming of owning one someday. But back then, owning a luxury car had been nothing more than a dream. Her family didn't have much, and every dollar her father earned went toward keeping food on the table. Yet, even as a little girl, Elizabeth had promised herself that one day, she would sit behind the wheel of a car that felt like it was built just for her. Elizabeth had inherited that dream, and over the years, she had built her life with that dream quietly tucked away in her heart. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificing sleep, enduring failures, and building a tech empire from the ground up. And today, after years of relentless hard work, she had finally decided to treat herself. But the staff at Crown Motors couldn't see the layers of Elizabeth's story. They only saw what was on the surface, and to them, that surface wasn't worth their time. Tom crossed the room toward her, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He approached with the kind of confidence that bordered on cockiness, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Excuse me, ma'am," Tom said as he approached Elizabeth, his tone polite but tinged with condescension. His eyes quickly scanned her outfit and bag, his judgment already made. "Are you lost? Can I help you with something?" Elizabeth turned to him, her warm smile unwavering. "Yes, I'd like to learn more about the new S-Class. I've heard wonderful things about its performance and safety features," she said, gesturing toward the silver sedan. Her voice was calm, self-assured. Tom raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at the worn leather bag on her shoulder. "The S-Class?" he repeated, his tone shifting slightly. "Well, that's quite the car. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to check out something a bit more practical?" Elizabeth's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered. "No, I'm quite sure. I've done my research, and this is the model I'm most interested in." Tom tilted his head, his smile growing wider but colder. "Oh, I see," he said as though humoring her. "This is one of our premium models. It's quite exclusive. Are you sure this is the car you're interested in?" Elizabeth nodded. "I'm sure," she replied simply. Tom forced a laugh, glancing over his shoulder at Rick, who was watching from a distance with a bemused expression. "All right, if you insist," Tom said, "but I should warn you, it's not exactly budget-friendly." Elizabeth's gaze hardened slightly, though her voice remained calm. "I'd still like to see it, if you don't mind." Tom didn't move. Instead, he folded his arms, his smirk widening. "Do you happen to have a budget in mind, ma'am?" It's just that cars like these can run upwards of 6 figures. I wouldn't want to waste your time." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, and he let out a soft chuckle. "Well, it's good to have high aspirations," he said, folding his arms, "but I think you'd find what you're looking for at our sister dealership down the road. They specialize in more affordable options. If you were in Elizabeth's shoes, what would you have done? Would you leave the car dealership shop immediately or wait to fight the prejudice? Let us know in the comments and click the subscribe button now if you support Elizabeth in this story." Elizabeth's smile faltered ever so slightly, but she held her composure. "I'm not interested in their inventory," she said, her tone still polite. "I came here to see this car." Before Tom could respond, Rick, the general manager, joined the conversation. Rick was older than Tom, with gray streaks in his hair and a permanent scowl etched onto his face. He prided himself on keeping the dealership's image intact, which often translated to dismissing anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of respectable clientele. "What's going on here?" Rick asked, his voice gruff. Tom smirked and gestured toward Elizabeth. "She's interested in the Lux Silver class," he said, barely hiding his amusement. "I was just pointing her in the right direction." Rick's gaze shifted to Elizabeth, his expression hardening. "Ma'am," he said bluntly, "this dealership deals exclusively in high-end vehicles. If you're not serious about purchasing, I suggest you don't waste our time." Elizabeth met his gaze, her calm demeanor unshaken. "I assure you I'm quite serious," she said firmly. Rick scoffed. "Look, we have real customers to attend to," he said, nodding toward a nearby couple who were being handed glasses of champagne by another salesman. "Tom's assessment is correct. You might feel more comfortable at our used car lot." The couple Rick referred to, a man in an expensive-looking blazer and a woman dripping in gold jewelry, glanced over at Elizabeth with thinly veiled judgment. The woman whispered something to the man, who smirked as he took a sip of his drink. Across the room, a few other staff members exchanged quiet laughs, pretending to be busy with other customers, but clearly enjoying the spectacle. Martha stood off to the side, her expression conflicted. Unlike her colleagues, she didn't find the situation amusing. There was something about Elizabeth, her poise, her quiet dignity, that didn't sit right with the way Tom was treating her. But Martha didn't dare speak up, not yet. Elizabeth, meanwhile, stood her ground. Her voice was steady, but there was a new edge to it. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "but I'd prefer to discuss the car's features, not its price." Tom opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, Rick called out from across the room, "Tom, don't waste too much time, all right? I'm sure she'd feel more comfortable at the used lot down the street." The room erupted into quiet laughter, the sound cutting through the air like a knife. Elizabeth's shoulders straightened, her gaze steady and unflinching. She had dealt with people like this before, people who judged her without knowing her, who underestimated her because of her appearance or her age or her skin color. But today, she wasn't here to be dismissed. Today, she had a plan. Meanwhile, Martha stood frozen near the reception desk, her hands gripping a clipboard. She wanted to step in, to say something, anything, but fear held her back. She had already seen Tom humiliate another employee just last week for questioning his methods. Martha's heart ached as she watched Elizabeth face their blatant disrespect, but she couldn't find the courage to act. Elizabeth, however, refused to back down. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to," she said, her voice calm but firm. Rick raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And who exactly are we talking to?" he asked with a smirk. Elizabeth didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly as she composed a message, her expression unreadable. The staff and customers watched her in silence, unsure of what she was doing. What Tom and Rick didn't realize was that Elizabeth Johnson wasn't just any customer. She was a woman who had spent her life building an empire by standing tall against people just like them. And today, she was about to remind them why underestimating her was a mistake. Elizabeth hit send and slipped her phone back into her bag. Then, without another word, she turned her attention back to the silver sedan, admiring it as though nothing had happened. Martha watched her in awe, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. For the first time, she wondered if this woman, this calm, composed stranger, might be someone far more powerful than she appeared. The run buzzed with tension, but Elizabeth remained unshaken. She had faced worse than this before, and she knew one thing for certain: the wheels were already in motion. Tom wasn't the type to hide his judgments, and as far as he was concerned, Elizabeth didn't belong in a place like this. Elizabeth left where Tom was and approached the reception desk, her voice calm and polite as she addressed the young staff member behind the counter. "Excuse me," she said, "do you have a brochure for the models in this section? I'd like to take a closer look." Before the receptionist could answer, Tom interjected, his tone dripping with condescension. "We don't hand out brochures for cars that aren't realistic options," he said, his smirk widening. "Let's not waste each other's time, ma'am." The words cut like a knife, but Elizabeth's face remained composed. She didn't flinch, though the sting of his remark was evident in her eyes. "I'd still like to see a brochure," she replied calmly. "I'm not sure it's your job to decide what's realistic for me." Tom chuckled, loud enough for the other staff members to hear. A few of them laughed along with him, their chuckles echoing through the showroom. Rick nodded approvingly at Tom, his arms crossed as he leaned back against a wall, watching the scene unfold with a smug look. Imagine being mocked for wanting to buy something you can actually afford to buy. How would you react? Hit the subscribe button to stand against injustice. Elizabeth's warm smile faded slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Perhaps I should speak to someone else," she said. "Someone who knows how to treat potential customers with respect." Tom rolled his eyes and leaned in slightly, his tone mocking. "You'll be waiting a long time for that," he said with a smirk. The staff around him laughed again, emboldened by his arrogance. The other customers in the showroom, dressed in designer clothes and dripping with wealth, glanced over at the scene. Some whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of judgment and curiosity. One woman, clutching a leather designer bag, shook her head slightly and murmured something to her companion. The man beside her chuckled, sipping champagne as though Elizabeth's treatment was a form of entertainment. Elizabeth's composure didn't waver, though her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her leather bag. She stood tall, her voice calm but firm. "I think I'll wait," she said simply, her gaze steady as she looked directly at Tom. "And we'll see how professional this dealership really is." Tom raised an eyebrow and turned to Rick. "She's still here," he said with exaggerated exasperation. "Rick, do you want to handle this, or should I call security?" Rick shrugged, his smirk never leaving his face. "You're doing fine," he said casually. "But yeah, go ahead and call security. We don't need her disrupting the experience for our real customers." Tom wasted no time. He pulled out his phone and made the call, his voice loud and dismissive. "Yeah, we've got a situation here," he said, glancing at Elizabeth with a smirk. "There's someone loitering in the showroom. Can you send someone to handle it?" Elizabeth stood silently, her expression calm, but her eyes burning with quiet resolve. Martha, the junior employee, watched from the corner of the room, her heart sinking with every word Tom said. She had seen this kind of treatment before, but something about Elizabeth's grace and composure made it all the more painful to witness. Martha wanted to step forward, to say something, but fear kept her rooted in place. All she could do was mutter a quiet apology under her breath, one that Elizabeth likely didn't even hear. Minutes later, a security guard entered the showroom. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor. But as he approached Elizabeth, his steps slowed. Something about her presence, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, made him hesitate. He glanced at Tom, then back at Elizabeth. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, "I've been asked to escort you out. They're saying you're disrupting the customers." Elizabeth met his gaze, her expression calm but piercing. "I'm not disrupting anyone," she said. "I'm simply asking to see a brochure for the cars in this section." The guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the unfairness of the situation, but Tom's impatient voice cut through the tension. "She's wasting everyone's time," he said loudly. "Just do your job." The guard hesitated for a moment longer before stepping aside and gesturing toward the door. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly, "but I have to ask you to leave." Elizabeth gave him a small nod, her dignity intact despite the humiliation. "I understand," she said softly. She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps steady, her back straight. As she passed Martha, the young employee whispered, "I'm so sorry." Elizabeth gave her a small, reassuring smile but said nothing. Outside the dealership, Elizabeth sat in her car, taking a moment to compose herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The weight of the experience pressed down on her, but she refused to let it consume her. She had faced worse in her life, and she wasn't about to let a group of arrogant salesmen define her worth. With calm determination, Elizabeth began typing a series of texts. Her fingers moved quickly, the messages concise but clear. Each text was sent to a key contact, individuals who would understand the gravity of what had just happened and had the power to do something about it. As she hit send on the final message, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The wheels were already in motion. What Tom and Rick didn't realize was that Elizabeth Johnson's strength came from a lifetime of overcoming obstacles. Growing up in her father's small garage, she had learned to dream big and fight hard, and today, her quiet result would prove to be more powerful than their prejudice. Elizabeth, sitting in her car, her phone resting on the dashboard, her gaze steady. She wasn't just preparing to respond to their treatment. She was preparing to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Click the subscribe button now if you're enjoying the story. Elizabeth sat in her car, her hands steady as she scrolled through her phone. Her expression was calm, her demeanor focused. She wasn't someone who gave in to anger or bitterness, not after everything she had been through in life. Instead, Elizabeth preferred action, decisive, calculated, and impactful. She had been humiliated inside that dealership, but she wasn't leaving the situation unresolved. She reached for her phone, her fingers gliding swiftly across the screen. The first call she made was to her assistant, Clara, a sharp, efficient woman who had been her right hand for years. "Clara," Elizabeth said calmly but firmly, "I need you to connect me with the board of directors at Crown Motors immediately. Tell them it's urgent." Clara didn't ask questions. She never did. "Right away, Miss Johnson," she replied before hanging up. She took a deep breath and dialed her second number. The phone rang twice before a voice on the other end answered. The staff inside the dealership had no idea that the woman they just mocked was not only connected to the company's leadership, but had the power to shake its foundation. Elizabeth spoke calmly, relaying every detail of her experience inside the showroom to a member of the dealership's board of directors. Her voice was measured yet firm. "This isn't just about me," she explained. "This is about the culture being cultivated at one of your most prominent locations. If this is how they treat potential customers, it speaks volumes about the leadership or lack thereof in this dealership." The person on the other end of the line listened carefully, their tone growing more serious with every word. "I'll escalate this immediately," they assured her. "This behavior is unacceptable, and it will be addressed." Elizabeth thanked them and ended the call. Without missing a beat, she sent a series of texts to other board members, telling them there was an emergency. Her fingers moved quickly, the messages concise but firm. She included specific details, leaving no room for misunderstanding. But she wasn't done. She opened her contacts and began reaching out to her network of business associates, individuals who wielded influence in the auto industry. Elizabeth knew that change didn't happen in isolation. It required a collective effort. As she composed her final message, a faint smile played on her lips. She hit send and set her phone down, her gaze steady. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no turning back. Elizabeth's phone rang. It was Clara. "The board members are on the line, Miss Johnson," she said. "Good," Elizabeth replied, her voice calm but steely. She switched to the call. "Gentlemen," she began, her tone authoritative, "I'm contacting you about an urgent matter. I just left one of your dealerships, and I must say, the experience was enlightening. The staff there, including the general manager, have displayed a level of prejudice and unprofessionalism that's unacceptable for a company like ours." Elizabeth recounted the incident in precise, measured words, sparing no detail. Her voice didn't waver, but there was an unmistakable edge of emotion. "I won't stand for this," she concluded. "This isn't just about me. It's about the message we're sending as a company. We pride ourselves on excellence, but excellence doesn't stop at the product. It must extend to how we treat every individual who walks through our doors." The board members exchanged muted acknowledgments. "We'll address this immediately," Richard assured her. Her message was brief but clear. "We need to set an example." Back inside the dealership, Tom leaned against the counter, laughing with Rick. The two of them were reveling in their sense of superiority, completely unaware of the storm Elizabeth had set in motion. Rick leaned against the counter in his sharply tailored suit, sipping on an espresso. He smirked at Tom, who was now mimicking Elizabeth's calm demeanor in an exaggerated, mocking tone. "I'd like to see this car," Tom said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Honestly, the audacity of some people." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know where these people get the idea that they can walk in here and pretend they can afford what we sell." A middle-aged white man with graying hair, dressed in an impeccable navy suit, approached the counter to ask about a specific model. Immediately, Tom's tone shifted. "Of course, sir," he said with an overly polished smile. "Let me get the details for you. Champagne while you wait." The man nodded appreciatively, and Tom motioned for Martha to bring a glass. Martha, the dealership's newest hire, her brown hair was tied back neatly and her uniform was impeccably pressed, but her timid demeanor contrasted sharply with the bold arrogance of her colleagues. Watching the earlier exchange between Elizabeth and Tom, her stomach twisting with unease, Martha stood by a desk, fiddling nervously with a stack of brochures. She couldn't erase the image of Elizabeth's composed yet pained expression as she was humiliated. Martha knew it was wrong, every part of it, but speaking up felt impossible in an environment where Rick and Tom's dominance suffocated any sense of fairness. "Can you believe her?" Tom scoffed, turning to Martha. "Walking in here like she could actually afford one of these cars? The nerve of some people." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "These people walk in thinking they belong here. It's ridiculous. Honestly, it's our job to weed them out. We're doing the company a favor." The two men laughed again, their voices carrying across the showroom. The other staff members either joined in or avoided eye contact, unwilling to challenge their authority. But Martha, standing by the reception desk, couldn't stay silent any longer. She had watched the entire encounter with Elizabeth unfold, and it didn't sit right with her. Elizabeth had been nothing but polite, and yet she was treated with such blatant disrespect. "Don't you think you're taking this too far?" Martha finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "She was polite and didn't deserve that treatment." Tom laughed, an exaggerated, mocking sound that echoed across the showroom. "Oh, come on, Martha. Don't be naive. People like her come in here all the time, wasting our time and energy. You'll learn soon enough." Martha swallowed hard but stood her ground. That woman wasn't rude. She just wanted to look at a car. She didn't deserve to be treated like that. The room fell silent for a moment as Tom turned to face her, his smirk replaced by a sneer. "If you like her so much," he said mockingly, "maybe you should join her outside." Rick laughed, clapping Tom on the back. "Careful, Martha," he said with a smirk. "We wouldn't want you to lose your job over something so trivial." Martha's face flushed, but she stood her ground. "It's not trivial," she said softly. "Treating people with respect shouldn't be optional." Tom rolled his eyes and waved her off. "Why don't you focus on doing your job instead of worrying about things that don't concern you?" he snapped. Martha bit her lip and looked away, but the seed of defiance had been planted. Was Martha right for standing up against their prejudice? Subscribe to the channel now if you support Martha's actions. As the tension simmered in the showroom, Rick's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. His casual demeanor shifted immediately. The caller ID wasn't a number he could ignore. It was from the dealership's headquarters. It was the corporate office. His confident smirk faded as he stepped into the back office to take the call. Tom watched him leave, leaning casually against the counter. "What's up with him?" Tom asked Martha, who was busy organizing brochures. "I don't know," she said, keeping her eyes down, though her heart raced. She had seen the subtle shift in Rick's expression before he walked away. Something was happening. Rick returned a few minutes later, his face pale and beads of sweat forming on his brow. He avoided eye contact with Tom and muttered, "I need to make another call." Tom frowned. "What's going on?" "Just stay out here," Rick snapped, his usual composure slipping. He disappeared into the office again, shutting the door behind him. Martha watched from the corner of the showroom, sensing that the tide was beginning to shift. He made the call, his voice no longer carrying an air of confidence. "Rick speaking," he said. The voice on the other end was firm, cutting through his arrogance like a knife. "We've received a complaint from one of our major shareholders regarding the treatment they received at your dealership. Care to explain?" Rick's face turned pale. he stammered, his usual smooth talk failing him. I'm not sure what you mean, he said weakly. There must be some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, the voice on the other end replied sharply. We've been informed that a major shareholder was mocked and kicked out of your dealership. This behavior is unacceptable, and we demand an immediate explanation. Rick's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The line went dead, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. He turned to Tom, his expression a mix of panic and disbelief. We've got a problem, he said, his voice low. Tom raised an eyebrow, still oblivious to the gravity of the situation. What kind of problem? He asked casually. Rick leaned in, lowering his voice further. That woman, she's not just anybody. The board just called me, and they're demanding answers. Tom's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He brushed it off with a wave of his hand. Relax, he said. They're just trying to scare us. What can she really do? Rick didn't respond. For the first time, he realized that they had underestimated Elizabeth, gravely underestimated her. Inside, Rick emerged from the office, his face a shade lighter. He whispered something to Tom, whose confident smirk slowly melted into confusion, and then panic. Then he told Tom, fearfully, that woman we kicked out is connected to the board. Wait, what do you mean she's connected to the board? Tom asked, his voice rising. She's a major shareholder, you idiot. Rick hissed. And the board's involved now. Elizabeth sat in her car, watching the dealership's front doors. Her phone buzzed with another message. We've escalated the matter. They're on notice. A faint smile crossed her lips, not of satisfaction, but of resolve. She wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. The tension in the dealership was palpable. Customers began to notice the nervous energy radiating from the staff, and even the ever-composed Tom started fidgeting. Martha watched silently from her corner, her unease mixing with a faint glimmer of hope. Something big was happening, and she could sense that the arrogant hierarchy that ruled the dealership might finally face a reckoning. Meanwhile, outside in her car, Elizabeth received another notification on her phone. It was a response from one of the board members, confirming that immediate action would be taken. She read the message carefully, her expression calm but resolute. What Tom and Rick didn't realize was that their mockery and arrogance were about to cost them dearly. Elizabeth wasn't just another customer they had insulted, someone with the power to expose their prejudice and bring about real change. And she wasn't finished yet. Back inside the dealership, the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter had died down, replaced by an uneasy tension. Martha watched as Rick and Tom huddled together, their confident facades cracking. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she could sense that the tides were turning. Elizabeth, still seated in her car, took one last look at the dealership before starting the engine. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. This was only the beginning, and she was determined to see it through to the end. Elizabeth had faced discrimination before, but this time, she had the resources and the resolve to fight back. The staff inside the dealership had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Elizabeth sat quietly in the back seat of a sleek black car, the faint hum of the engine underscoring the sharp focus in her eyes. Her calm, long demeanor belied the storm that had been brewing since she left the dealership. The car pulled into the lot, its gleaming exterior reflecting the harsh sunlight. It came to a smooth stop right in front of the main entrance, turning the heads of staff and customers alike. The door opened, and Elizabeth stepped out with quiet confidence. She was flanked by two board members, both impeccably dressed in tailored suits, and her legal counsel, a no-nonsense woman whose sharp gaze alone demanded respect. Inside the dealership, the bustling showroom came to an abrupt halt. Conversations trailed off as heads turned toward the glass doors. The staff froze mid-task, their faces etched with confusion and uncertainty. Rick, the general manager, was the first to notice the group entering. His jaw tightened as he caught sight of Elizabeth. Tom, leaning casually against a desk, followed Rick's gaze and immediately straightened, his expression shifting from smugness to a flicker of awe. The once confident air of the dealership began to crack under the weight of the imposing group that entered. Elizabeth walked in with an air of quiet authority, her steps measured and deliberate. The two board members trailed slightly behind her, their stern faces scanning the room. The energy shifted palpably. Even the customers felt the tension, exchanging curious glances and whispering among themselves. Rick adjusted his tie and rushed toward Elizabeth, a strange smile plastered on his face. "Oh, Mrs. Johnson," he exclaimed, his voice suddenly dripping with an unnatural sweetness. "It's so good to see you again. Please, allow me to personally assist you with anything you need." Tom followed suit, suddenly abandoning the mocking arrogance he had displayed just hours earlier. "Mrs. Johnson, welcome back. I hope you'll forgive any earlier miscommunication. Let us ensure your visit this time is absolutely perfect." Elizabeth's calm, piercing gaze scanned the room. She said nothing at first, simply letting the silence stretch long enough to make Rick and Tom squirm. Their earlier laughter and condescension echoed in her memory, but she didn't let her emotions show. Instead, she gave the faintest smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Rick, desperate to cover his earlier behavior, gestured enthusiastically toward the cars. "Please take your time. I'd love to personally show you our latest models. Champagne? Coffee? Anything you need, just say the word." Tom chimed in, his voice oozing with fake sincerity. "We want to make this experience exceptional for you. You deserve the best, after all." Their sudden fawning was almost comical, like watching poorly rehearsed actors scramble to salvage a botched performance. But Elizabeth remained unmoved. She didn't acknowledge their feigned kindness, nor did she respond to their over-the-top gestures. Her silence was more powerful than any words she could have said. What would you do if you were in Elizabeth's shoes and the people who earlier mocked you are now showing you fake kindness and attention because the tides of authority changed? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to click the subscribe button if you support Elizabeth and stand against prejudice. Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. Her calm eyes met Rick's, and she held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then one of the board members stepped in, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Mr. Rick Sanford, we're here to address a formal complaint regarding the mistreatment of one of this company's most valuable shareholders. Would you care to explain what happened here earlier today?" Rick blinked, momentarily stunned. "Shareholder?" he stammered, his face draining of color. I don't understand." "You don't understand?" Elizabeth's voice cut through the air, quiet but searing. "You didn't even bother to ask me a single question when I walked into this dealership. Instead, you made assumptions and treated me with blatant disrespect. Tell me, Mr. Sanford, is that your standard of customer service?" Tom, who had been standing slightly behind Rick, tried to recover his usual smug demeanor. "This is probably a misunderstanding, ma'am," he interjected, forcing a nervous laugh. "We handle hundreds of customers every week, and sometimes mistakes happen." Elizabeth's gaze shifted to Tom, her calm expression unyielding. "A mistake? Is that what you call laughing at someone and telling them to go to a used car lot? Is it also a mistake to call security on someone simply because you've decided they don't belong here?" The room was silent. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Rick attempted to salvage the situation. "We are sorry, ma'am. We didn't know who you were," he said, his voice growing defensive. "If you had just told us." "Told you?" Elizabeth interrupted, her tone still calm but now laced with an edge that silenced him instantly. "I shouldn't have to announce my accomplishments or my financial status to be treated with basic respect. No one should." Tom shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado now completely absent. The faint sound of a customer clearing their throat in the corner was the only thing breaking the tense silence. The board members exchanged glances before one of them addressed Rick again. "This behavior is not only unprofessional, but it's a direct violation of this company's values. We pride ourselves on inclusivity and respect, and what we've heard today is deeply troubling." Rick's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Tom, for once, stayed silent, his face pale. Elizabeth turned slightly, her gaze falling on Martha, who was standing near the back of the room, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Martha," Elizabeth said, her tone softening slightly, "could you come here for a moment?" Martha hesitated, her eyes darting to Rick and Tom, before she slowly stepped forward. She looked both nervous and confused, but there was also a flicker of hope in her eyes. "This young woman," Elizabeth began, addressing the board members, "was the only person in this entire dealership who showed me any kindness today. She didn't laugh, she didn't mock, and she didn't make me feel unwelcome. She may not have said much, but her professionalism was evident, even in her silence. Martha's cheeks flushed, and she glanced down, overwhelmed by the attention. Elizabeth continued, now addressing Rick and Tom directly. Leadership is about more than authority. It's about character, about setting an example. And from what I've seen today, neither of you embody any of those qualities. One of the board members stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. In light of today's events, we've decided that immediate action is necessary. Rick Sanford, as of this moment, you are relieved of your duties as general manager. Tom, your employment with this company is also terminated, effective immediately. The gasps that rippled through the room were audible. Rick's face turned a deep shade of red, and he opened his mouth to protest, but the board member raised a hand to silence him. Your actions have not only disrespected a major shareholder but have also jeopardized this dealership's reputation. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Elizabeth turned back to Martha, who looked completely stunned by the unfolding events. Martha, Elizabeth said gently, your professionalism today didn't go unnoticed. This dealership needs leadership that reflects the values this company was built on. I'd like to recommend you for the position of interim manager. Martha's eyes widened, and she shook her head slightly, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Me? But I'm just capable, Elizabeth interrupted, a warm smile gracing her face. You're capable, and that's what matters. The board members nodded in agreement. One of them stepped forward, addressing Martha directly. We'll arrange for the necessary training and support, but for now you'll step into the role. We trust you'll handle it with the professionalism you've already shown. Martha's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down. The staff and customers watched in stunned silence as the events unfolded. Rick and Tom stood frozen, their arrogance shattered. Elizabeth turned one last time to face them. Respect isn't just for the people you deem worthy, it's for everyone. And today you've learned the cost of forgetting that. With that, she walked out of the dealership, her head held high, her quiet strength leaving an indelible mark on everyone in the room. Tom stood frozen in the middle of the dealership, his mind reeling. The smug confidence he had carried all day had vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, hard realization that his actions had cost him everything. The words of the board member echoed in his head like a relentless drumbeat. Your employment with this company is terminated, effective immediately. He glanced toward Rick, searching for any sign of support or solidarity, but found none. Rick stood a few steps away, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. He had been suspended, pending a full investigation, and while his dismissal hadn't been finalized yet, he could already feel the weight of its inevitability. Click the subscribe button if you believe they both deserved the consequences of their actions. The other staff members kept their distance, their expressions ranging from shocked to quietly satisfied. Some of them had always resented Tom's arrogance and Rick's blind reinforcement of his behavior. Now, they watched the fallout unfold with a mix of awe and vindication, understanding that the system that had once enabled such behavior was being dismantled before their eyes. Elizabeth remained calm and composed, her gaze sharp and unwavering as she stood at the center of the dealership. The air was thick with tension, but she carried herself with the same quiet strength that had defined her throughout the ordeal. She didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. This wasn't a victory for her. It was a necessary step toward accountability and change. The board members took charge of the situation, issuing clear directives to the remaining staff. The dealership was to be placed under immediate review, policies would be rewritten, training programs would be implemented, and Elizabeth herself would play a key role in reshaping the dealership's operations. Her influence wasn't just a suggestion, it was a mandate from the highest levels of the company. Outside, the once bustling showroom grew quieter. Wealthy customers, who had earlier been served champagne and given special attention, now whispered among themselves, realizing they had witnessed something far more profound than a routine sales transaction. The woman they had subtly judged and dismissed had emerged as a force of reckoning, reshaping the environment they had taken for granted. Elizabeth's gaze softened as she turned toward Martha, who was still processing her unexpected promotion to interim manager. Martha, Elizabeth said gently, her voice carrying an unmistakable warmth, this is just the beginning. The way you treated me today showed character and courage. Use that same kindness to lead this team, to create an environment where everyone feels respected, regardless of who they are. Martha nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I promise I'll do everything I can to make this a place you'd be proud of. Elizabeth gave her a small but genuine smile. I'm already proud. Now it's your turn to prove that leadership doesn't come from power. It comes from purpose. The board members, satisfied with the immediate actions taken, stepped outside with Elizabeth to continue discussing plans for long-term changes. As they spoke, the tension that had filled the dealership began to dissipate, and that replaced by a sense of possibility. Elizabeth took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. As she reflected on the day's events, her mind drifted back to the small garage where her love for cars had first been sparked, where her father had taught her the value of resilience and the importance of standing up for what was right. This isn't just about me, she thought. It's about everyone who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or disrespected. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did today. With the conversation with the board wrapping up, Elizabeth turned toward her dream car, a gleaming luxury sedan that had caught her eye the moment she walked into the dealership. The car now felt less like a prize and more like a symbol, a testament to her journey, her triumph, and her refusal to be defined by anyone else's prejudice. She opened the driver's door and slid into the seat, her hands gripping the smooth leather steering wheel. The engine purred to life, its sound both powerful and comforting. As she adjusted the rearview mirror, her reflection stared back at her, calm, strong, and resolute. Elizabeth didn't just win today. She stood against discrimination with grace and strength. She transformed a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change, setting an example that would echo far beyond the walls of that dealership. She proved that respect is a right, not a privilege, and that true power lies in refusing to accept anything less. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories of justice, resilience, and perseverance. Together, we can create a world where kindness and equality prevail. See you in the next one.